This is one of those things I've kept mostly to myself for a long time. It happened when I was around 25, maybe 26, long before I got married, long before kids, back when I was a completely different version of myself. Not worse, just freer. I had the kind of disposable time and tolerance for risk that I genuinely cannot access anymore. A few times a year, I used to take off alone on backpacking trips, usually somewhere in the Appalachians. I'd drive to some remote trailhead, push deep into the backcountry, way off the marked trail, and disappear for a few days. No signal, no people, nothing. I loved every second of it. My friends thought I'd lost my mind. Looking back, they weren't entirely wrong. This particular trip was in the Cherokee National Forest, and it permanently changed how I think about going into the woods alone. I'd been out there for 2 full days. Everything was going exactly the way I wanted it to. Good weather, an empty trail, and not a single human being in sight since the first morning. That all changed on the afternoon of day 2. I started noticing a dark mass of storm clouds stacking up to the west. I wasn't particularly concerned. I'd been caught in backcountry rain before, and it was never more than an inconvenience. But within an hour, I understood this wasn't a passing shower. The wind turned sharp, and the temperature dropped fast enough that I had to stop and pull on another layer. By the time the rain hit, I was already scanning for somewhere to wait it out. The problem was that I was in a wide open section of trail with almost no natural cover. It went from gusty to violent in minutes. Smaller trees were bending sideways, and I could hear branches tearing loose and crashing down through the canopy somewhere above me. Lightning was hitting close enough that I could feel it, and I was hiking at elevation with a metal-framed pack on my back. That combination started to feel genuinely dangerous. I pushed forward, completely drenched, searching the tree line on both sides for anything solid enough to shelter under. That's when I spotted it, a dark shape through the trees off to my left. Small, angular, clearly built by a person. As I closed the distance, it resolved into a tiny single-story cabin. It looked like it had been out there for decades, maybe longer. A hunting shelter, maybe, or an old homesteader's cabin that no one had touched in years. I don't think I've ever felt relief like that. I practically ran to it. The door pushed open without resistance. Inside, it was dim, and it smelled genuinely terrible, but it was dry. There wasn't much to look at. A wooden chair, a small table, an empty cot frame shoved against the far wall, and a stone fireplace on the right side, packed solid with old ash and debris. I didn't care about any of it. I stripped off my soaked clothes, picked a spot on the floor, and lay down. I was operating on pure survival instinct at that point. The only thing that mattered was that the rain was no longer hitting me. It wasn't until I'd been inside for 10 or 15 minutes that I actually started paying attention to where I was. With the storm raging outside, there was nothing to do but grab my flashlight and look around. So that's what I did. And the more I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. There was a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner near the cot frame. It didn't look old like the rest of the cabin. That confused me. There were also a few cans and some water jugs on the table, which made me think someone had been using this place fairly recently. Another backpacker, maybe, or a hunter. Finding gear in a remote cabin wasn't all that unusual, but some other details weren't so easy to explain away. Near the door, there were marks on the wall. I assumed at first they were just wear from age, but when I stepped closer, I could see they were scratches, dozens of them. Some shallow, some gouged deep into the wood. They had no obvious pattern, no order I could make sense of. I stepped back and took a longer look at the door itself. The handle was a simple latch, normal enough. But I pushed it open to look at the outside of the frame, and that's when I saw it. There was a metal bracket on the exterior of the door frame, the kind designed to hold a padlock. The bracket was on the outside. There was no corresponding lock mechanism on the inside. That door could only be secured from the outside. I stood there for a moment and then walked over to the window. The glass was intact, which surprised me given the apparent age of the structure. Then I saw why. Screws had been driven through the frame at each corner, locking it shut, also from the outside. And around the interior edge of the frame, there were more scratches. Deep ones. The kind you make when you're trying to force something open with your hands. It hit me all at once. Someone had been held in this cabin, kept there intentionally. I thought about leaving right then. I genuinely considered it. But the storm outside sounded like it was getting worse, not better, and everything inside the cabin looked old. Even the sleeping bag that concerned me, when I looked at it more carefully, it was stiff and dusty. Whatever had happened in this place felt like it was firmly in the past. I made the decision to stay. I'm not sure exactly how much time passed. An hour? Maybe more. The rain on the roof was so loud, it made it hard to hear much of anything. That's probably why I didn't pick up on the other sound, until it had already been going for a while. A scraping or scratching sound, coming from somewhere along the exterior of the left wall. My first instinct was that it was a low branch dragging across the siding. But then I tried to remember whether there were any branches low enough to touch the walls, and I wasn't sure there were. Then came two heavy thumps on the porch. Those did not sound like storm sounds. I was on my feet immediately. I did that thing where you go completely still and fix your eyes on a random point on the wall and just listen. But the rain was so loud that even if someone was moving out there, I wouldn't have been able to track them. That thought made it worse. The idea that sounds I should have been hearing were just being swallowed up by the storm. I stared at the window for a long time, not quite able to bring myself to walk over and look through it. If someone was out there, they might already be looking in. I stayed frozen like that for what felt like a very long time. Eventually, I started to come back down. Maybe it was just the storm. Maybe an animal investigating the only structure for miles. I was almost ready to let the whole thing go when I felt it. Pressure against the door. Not a knock. Not a tap. The slow, heavy lean of something pressing its full weight against the wood from the outside. The latch rattled once. Then the pressure released. My heart was going fast and my thinking sharpened immediately. Something clicked. Why would anyone be circling a cabin in a storm like this, pressing on the walls, but not coming inside? The door wasn't locked. Nothing was holding it shut from the outside. There was no barrier, so why weren't they coming in? And then I thought about the bracket on the doorframe, the screws in the window, the scratches. Maybe they weren't trying to get in. Maybe they were trying to make sure I stayed in. I don't know if that reasoning was correct, or if my mind had just gone somewhere dark. But I stopped trying to talk myself out of it. I started throwing things into my backpack as fast as I could move. I was 30 seconds from walking out that door when I heard the window explode behind me. I spun around just in time to see something come through the glass. A second later, the room was on fire. Not slowly catching, on fire. The walls were burning before I could understand what had happened. Heat hit me like a physical force. The door wouldn't open. I threw myself at it, and it gave, collapsing completely off its frame, and I went down with it onto the porch. I got back up and ran. I couldn't see where I was going. I was crashing through woods in pitch dark and pouring rain, just trying to put distance between myself and the fire. But before I'd gotten far, something hit me from behind, and I was on the ground. There was a person on top of me. I don't remember thinking clearly at that point. I was clawing, kicking, yelling. He was yelling too, and he had his hands around my throat, working to get me into a chokehold. He went for my eyes with his fingers. I started to feel the edges of my vision going dark, but I managed to get some leverage and shove him off. I got up and kept running, and behind me I could hear him screaming. I looked back twice. The first time I could see the cabin clearly, a full fireball through the trees, completely engulfed. The second time, the glow had shrunk, but was still visible. I just kept running. For all I knew, he was right behind me. I didn't stop until my legs quit on me. I found a spot where two large fallen trees had come to rest against each other, leaving a narrow gap underneath that blocked most of the rain. I crawled into it and collapsed. I couldn't feel my body. I sat in that crouch position and focused on keeping my breathing even. Time lost all meaning. Eventually, sensation started coming back, and when it did, I told myself it was move or die. Whoever had been out there hadn't given up, and they couldn't be far away. I got up and started moving through the forest. I didn't know where the trail was. I didn't really care. I honest to God cannot tell you how I made it out of those woods that night, but I did. I stumbled onto a trail at some point and followed it. I was soaked, my hands were bleeding, and I was moving mostly on adrenaline. Eventually the rain thinned out and I was able to get my bearings. I made it to a trailhead. I don't remember most of what happened after that. The first person I encountered drove me to a hospital. I had second-degree burns on my left forearm and the back of my neck. The doctors said I was fortunate I hadn't inhaled significantly more smoke. None of it was permanent, but it took a long time to heal. By the time I was back home and fully recovered, I had made myself a promise. No more solo trips. Someone had deliberately set that cabin on fire while I was inside. That's the only explanation I have that makes any sense. It was a metal-roofed structure in the middle of a thunderstorm. Wood doesn't become a fireball in 2 seconds unless something was done to it beforehand. Unless the walls had been prepared. The police got everything I had, but I could tell they weren't going to push it. I hadn't been on any marked trail. There was nothing to find. I told my wife that I stopped doing solo trips because I grew up and got more careful. She accepted that. And she's not entirely wrong, but she doesn't know about this. And I know I'm never going back alone. My name is James. This was maybe 7 or 8 years ago, when I was in my early 20s and still had the kind of judgment I look back on now, with a mix of nostalgia and horror. I had a friend named Charles, who was legendary in our group for finding places nobody was supposed to be. Abandoned factories, shuttered buildings, fenced-off structures out in the middle of nowhere. If a place was off limits, Charles had already been there and had photos to prove it. He spent serious time on Google Earth and obscure urban exploration forums, and he was constantly dropping screenshots in the group chat, new places he'd scoped out, new theories about how to get in. Most of our friends would hear his pitches and say something like that sounds like a great way to end up arrested and change the subject. I was usually the exception. Charles and I had been close since high school, and I think what held us together was that we had roughly the same threshold for risk. Where other people heard that sounds insane and shut down, I heard it and wanted a departure time. That dynamic led to some genuinely great memories. It also led to a few situations where I look back and wonder how we both walked away. This is one of those situations. One weekend, Charles texted me about a decommissioned fire lookout tower he'd found somewhere deep in a forest a few hours from us. He said it had been sitting out there untouched for years. Completely abandoned. He wanted to hike out to it, climb to the top, and spend the night up there. I was skeptical. Those structures tend to be fenced off, or at least posted. But the image he was describing was hard to ignore. A 70-foot tower in the middle of a remote forest with unobstructed views in every direction. I told him I'd at least come and take a look. We drove out early on a Friday morning and made it into the woods by mid-afternoon. Charles had planned everything: the route, the gear, how to locate the tower once we were off the trail. He told me the off-trail hike would be roughly 4 miles, and he had a specific way of getting there that he refused to explain in full detail. I half expected us to wander around for hours and find nothing. That's what made it so disorienting when we actually found it. I saw it through the trees first, and my first response was to say "no way" out loud. Even from a distance, it was taller than I'd imagined. We pushed through to the base, and the first thing that struck me was that it was completely unprotected. No fence, no gate, no warning signage. Just a massive steel structure sitting in a forest, clearing like it had been waiting. The cab at the very top was a small square room with windows on all 4 sides. To reach it, you followed a zigzagging metal staircase up the frame and then switched to a vertical ladder for the final stretch. The whole thing looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in a long time. Lower railings were bent or completely missing. There was graffiti on the support beams at the base. It was not something a reasonable person would look at and think, "Yes, I'll climb that." But Charles was practically vibrating with excitement. While I was still assessing whether this was a terrible idea, he had already started up. I yelled at him to slow down. Then I thought for another second, told myself to stop overthinking, and started climbing behind him. We moved carefully, testing each step before committing our weight. Most of them held, but there were a few places where the bolts had rusted out and the steps shifted underfoot. The vertical ladder section near the cab was the most unsettling part. More than 20 feet of straight-up climbing with only a narrow metal safety cage around you. The adrenaline was real. Charles loved it. He reached the top without any issue. The view made it worth every second of the climb. Miles of forest in every direction, and we had timed our arrival so that the sun was about an hour from setting. The wraparound walkway outside the cab was where we settled in first. We opened some beers, talked, and watched the sky shift from orange to purple to deep blue as the sun dropped below the tree line. Once the light was gone, the forest below us disappeared completely. Total darkness in every direction. No artificial lights anywhere. Not even a distant glow. The stars overhead were the clearest I have ever seen, without question. But being up there in the dark, knowing there was an entire forest stretched out below us that we couldn't see, started getting to me in a way that was hard to shake. There was something uncomfortable about the idea of being highly visible while being completely blind to what was underneath. Charles picked up on my mood and started messing with me, grabbing my shoulder and pretending he'd seen something. I was not amused. But the thing that genuinely irritated me was when he grabbed his metal water bottle and slammed it against the side of the tower frame. The sound was enormous, a deep, resonating clang that echoed out into the forest in all directions, almost certainly audible for miles. I told him we needed to go inside, and he finally listened. The cab itself had been cleared out a long time ago. Nothing much remained in there. Charles said he wanted to finish his beer outside and would join me in a few minutes. I went in, picked a corner, and started laying out my sleeping setup. I had my bag half unrolled when Charles spoke to me from outside, and the tone of his voice made me stop immediately. He wasn't joking around. He said my name quietly and told me to come outside. I walked back around to where he was sitting and saw that he was pointing downward at an angle into the darkness of the forest below. It took me a few seconds. Then I saw it. A light. Faint, distant, but definite. And it was moving, weaving between the trees at what appeared to be walking speed. My first assumption was that it was another person, someone who'd heard the noise from the tower and was headed toward us. I whispered to Charles that we were probably about to get confronted by a ranger or arrested, and I was not happy about it. He turned and looked at me with a confused expression. He said he didn't think it was a person. I asked him what he meant. He said the light was moving too consistently. No swing, no variation, just steady, smooth movement through the trees. He wasn't entirely wrong. A handheld flashlight or lantern tends to bob and shift with the person carrying it. This light wasn't doing that. But it could just have been too far away to tell. Neither of us said much after that. We just watched. Over the next few minutes, it became clear the light was getting closer. It also became clear that the movement was wrong. Too even. Too smooth. And then, just once, the light made a sudden jump. Not a step, not a stumble, but an abrupt forward skip, like someone had cut a few frames from a video and stitched it back together. Then it resumed its slow, steady approach. My hands were starting to sweat. After roughly 10 minutes of watching, the light reached the base of the tower and stopped. It sat directly below us, completely stationary. Charles and I looked straight down at it, waiting for someone to announce themselves. A ranger, a hiker, anyone. Nothing. Just the light, sitting still, pointing upward. Charles waited a while, and then, because he cannot help himself, leaned over the railing and shouted down at it. I looked at him like he had lost his mind. We got no response. He called down again. Still nothing. The light didn't move, so now we were stuck. 70 feet up a decommissioned fire tower in the middle of nowhere, with something at the base blocking our only way down and no response to anything we said. We watched that light for a good 30 minutes. It did not move once. I swept a flashlight beam straight down at the base of the tower, but I still couldn't see the source, just the light itself, sitting there. Eventually, we had no choice but to try to carry on. We went back inside the cab, set up our sleeping bags, and agreed that we were not sleeping, just waiting. I kept a window in my line of sight at all times. At some point, Charles suggested the light might be in lead someone had placed there as a prank. I didn't have a better theory, but I also couldn't think of who would bother doing that in the middle of a forest at night. And then I looked down, and the light was gone. Just gone. No gradual fading. It was there, and then it wasn't. I immediately started scanning, looking for it in other positions, other directions. Nothing. Just forest and dark. Charles said to relax, said whoever it was had probably left. I felt the opposite of relaxed. At least when the light was there, I knew where it was. The idea of whoever, or whatever, was down there now being somewhere I couldn't track was significantly worse. Charles pointed out that we'd hear anyone trying to climb the ladder, which was true. Metal on metal that close to us would be impossible to miss. I accepted that, and we went inside the cab and settled in. 20 minutes later, the sounds started. The first one was a metallic clang that rang up through the entire steel frame. Not a footstep. I want to be very clear about that. This was a deliberate, heavy impact, like someone had taken a wrench to one of the structural beams. A few minutes later, there was a grinding sound. Metal being forced against metal, sustained, lasting several seconds before stopping. Then another clang from a different location. That was the part that set my nerves on fire. The sounds were coming from different points along the structure, which meant whatever was causing them was moving around underneath us. Charles and I kept looking at each other. There was nothing to say. There was nothing to do. The sounds continued at irregular intervals. I was trying to track them, build a mental map of where they were coming from, whether they were ascending. I couldn't make sense of the pattern. Then I saw it. I was seated against the far wall of the cab, facing the windows on the opposite side. A dark shape moved across the glass. My brain took a second too long to process it. Then it crossed the next pane, and that was enough. I yelled before I could stop myself, and Charles scrambled back. The two of us hit the door and braced our backs against it. Both of us pressed against it as hard as we could. I kept scanning the windows looking for the shape, but there was nothing there, and that made no sense. Unless whatever I'd seen was crouching below the level of the glass, crawling around the outside of the cab, there was nowhere for it to go. The wraparound walkway was narrow. There was no place to hide. We stayed against that door, for hours. Neither of us slept. By the time the first gray light started to show through the windows, I was completely wrung out. When it was bright enough to see, I counted to 3 and shoved the door open hard. Nobody was behind it. We did a full sweep of the exterior walkway. Empty. I looked down to the base from every angle. Nothing. We grabbed our gear and started descending as fast as we could manage. We'd made it about 3/4 of the way down when Charles stopped in front of me on a landing and just stood there. I looked past him. An entire section of the staircase was missing. Not a few steps. A complete section. Gone. Just open air where it had been. It was physically impossible. We had both been sitting directly above it all night. We had been listening for exactly this kind of activity. We should have heard it. An entire section of metal staircase doesn't disappear quietly. And yet, we had no option except to jump across the gap. It wasn't an enormous distance, but it was terrifying with a drop below us. Charles landed wrong and twisted his ankle. I made it fine. We got the rest of the way down, hit the ground, and looked around. There was no one there. There was also no sign of the removed staircase sections. No metal, no hardware, no debris. We didn't stick around to look harder. We left. I still don't have an explanation for any of it. Not the light, not the shape I saw outside the window, not the sounds, and definitely not how an entire section of metal staircase was removed from a structure we were sitting on without us hearing it happen. Charles and I still talk about that night every time we see each other. We have never figured it out. I've been doing solo camping trips for close to 15 years now. Started in my early 20s, and I'm pushing 40. So, I know the risks as well as anyone. Because I go alone, and I go deep, I always bring a rifle. This particular trip was about 2 years ago in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. More than 700,000 acres. And if you pick your route carefully, you can hike for days without encountering another human being. I'd been having a rough stretch at work. My head wasn't right, and I needed a few days of complete separation from everything. I drove out Thursday morning, parked at a trailhead off a Forest Service road, and started hiking. The plan was 3 nights in the backcountry. Nothing more specific than that. I had my tent, enough food and water for 4 days, and my bolt action .308. First day was exactly what I was looking for. Covered about 7 miles before I found a flat clearing near a dry creek bed that felt right. I set up camp, collected wood, and had a fire going by sundown. I ate, had a beer, and let the fire burn down to coals. I didn't see another person the entire day. I was asleep by 10. I woke up in the middle of the night. Nothing woke me. My brain just switched on the way it does in unfamiliar places. I lay there for a moment, eyes open, staring up at the ceiling of the tent. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed something. A faint orange glow was coming through the fabric walls. I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. Maybe 200 yards through the trees, there was a fire. Not a wildfire, a campfire. Controlled, roughly the size you'd expect from someone's sight. It was flickering, which is how I could tell it was real. I watched it for a few minutes. I didn't hear any voices. I didn't see any movement around it. After a while, I decided it was another camper who'd fallen asleep without putting out their fire. Careless, but not unusual. I watched it a few more minutes to make sure it wasn't spreading, then went back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, that fire was the first thing I thought about. Not because it had frightened me, just because I was curious. I packed up, hiked toward where the fire had been, and reached the area in about 10 minutes. I was confident I had the right spot. There was a natural clearing at the right distance and angle. But when I got there, I stopped. There was no fire pit, no ring of stones, no ash, no scorched earth, no charred wood. The ground looked completely untouched, like no one had set foot there in weeks, maybe longer. I walked the whole clearing and checked the perimeter. Nothing. The area was pristine in a way that made no sense given what I'd seen the night before. I considered that I might have misjudged the direction, but there wasn't another clearing anywhere near the right position. I stood there for a while, genuinely unable to explain it. Then I moved on. I still had 2 nights ahead of me, and I wasn't going to let a strange detail ruin the trip. I hiked for most of the day. The terrain changed as I pushed deeper, the ground rising and the trees getting taller and older, until the canopy was thick enough to block most of the sky. It got quieter in there in a way I normally appreciate. I found a campsite around 4 in the afternoon, set up, had a fire, and was in my sleeping bag a little after 9. Something woke me in the middle of the night. A sound, loud enough to yank me out of a deep sleep immediately. A cracking and splitting, the sound a thick branch makes when it finally gives, except it didn't stop. It kept going. This prolonged, violent tearing that lasted 3 or 4 seconds and ended with a concussive thud that I felt in the ground beneath my sleeping pad. I knew immediately a tree had gone down somewhere in the forest nearby. If you've ever heard a full-size tree fall in the wild, you know it leaves an impression. The sound is almost prehistoric. It didn't scare me exactly, but the adrenaline hit was immediate, and I couldn't shake it. I lay there trying to figure out what had caused it. There was no storm, barely any wind. I couldn't come up with a satisfying explanation, but there wasn't much I could do in the dark, so I just lay there and tried to let the adrenaline drain off. Then, not 10 minutes later, it happened again. But this time, it was close, different direction from the first, and much, much louder. That same long tearing sound, followed by the detonation of branches cascading down, followed by a ground-shaking impact. This one was close enough that the sound was almost disorienting. I sat up. 2 trees, same night, no storm, no wind. 2 completely different parts of the forest. The most logical explanation I could think of was that the first fall had somehow triggered the second. But they hadn't been in the same area. They'd been in different directions. Whatever brought down the first tree had nothing to do with the second one, which meant these were 2 completely separate events. I was sitting there trying to make sense of that when the third thing happened, a sound that was entirely different from either of the previous 2. Low and continuous, not mechanical, not meteorological. A deep, sustained vocalization that I can only describe as somewhere between a groan and a growl, like someone clearing their throat, except stretched out and sustained. Constant, no breaks, no variation. Going on and on. I have heard bears. I have heard elk. I have heard bobcats doing things that don't sound like what you'd expect. This was not any of those. The sound had a deliberateness to it. It felt intentional in a way that wild animal sounds typically don't, and it went on, without pausing, for what I timed in my head as close to a full minute. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around as quietly as I could, pointed the barrel at the tent flap and waited. The sound faded eventually. Not a sudden stop, it tapered out, like whatever was making it had moved further away. And then the forest was quiet again. Completely quiet. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. Not even close. The moment daylight came, I was out of the tent. I packed everything as fast as my hands could move, shouldered my rifle, and started walking toward where the second tree had fallen. I needed to see it. I needed to confirm that what I'd heard was real and not something my exhausted, frightened brain had manufactured in the dark. I found it in about 10 minutes. The tree was enormous, a massive hardwood lying across a slope at an angle. Broken branches and debris scattered across a wide radius. Real. Undeniable. I walked over to the stump and looked at the break point. The wood at the fracture was pale and fresh, but the break was not what I expected. It wasn't a clean split or the kind of jagged fracture you see from wind stress. The wood looked torn. There were long, irregular grooves running through the material at multiple angles. Some of them looked close to an inch deep. Parts of the stump had been stripped in a way I didn't have a word for. Not cut, not chewed in any sense I was familiar with. Something had worked on the wood aggressively, from multiple directions, until the tree came down. Bark had been peeled away from the lower trunk in long strips, and the exposed wood underneath had that same gouged, shredded quality. I've seen what beavers do to trees. This was not that. Beavers leave clean, precise marks. I've seen woodpecker damage, insect damage, storm damage. None of those categories fit what I was looking at. Whatever brought this tree down had done it deliberately. And then I felt something shift in my gut. I needed to leave. That feeling was very clear and very sudden. I turned to go, and something on the ground near a cluster of broken branches caught my eye. A small pile of items, sitting on the forest floor as if they'd been placed there. I recognized them before I'd consciously processed what I was seeing. A blue bandana, a carabiner. Both of them were mine. I opened my pack and checked. Both items were gone. I closed the pack, picked up my rifle, and moved. I don't know if running was the right choice. It probably announced my presence to anything that might have been watching. But I ran anyway. I needed distance between myself and that spot immediately. The hike back took most of the day. The entire time, I had the absolute certainty that I was being watched, that something was moving parallel to me through the trees, just beyond my line of sight. I kept my rifle in my hands from the moment I left the tree until the moment I reached my car. I made it to the trailhead at about 3 p.m. and drove away faster than I should have. My first call once I had a signal was to the police. I don't think they took it seriously. That's fine. I understood there wasn't much they could do. What I couldn't get past, what I still can't get past, is the items. Someone or something had been inside my camp while I was asleep, gone through my gear, and then arranged those items at the site of a felled tree miles away. That implies deliberate coordination. That implies I was being followed from the very first night, that the fire I saw and couldn't explain was related to all of it. I still have no rational explanation for what brought those trees down. I genuinely don't believe it was human. But I also can't name the animal that could do what I saw done to that stump. I don't know what the sound was. I don't know what was watching me. I still go camping. That part of me doesn't quit. But this one has stayed with me in a way that none of my other experiences have. I don't think it's going away.